If you had been born 40,000 years ago, there's a real chance you would already be dead by the time you're reading this. Not from anything dramatic, not eaten by a predator, not killed in some tribal conflict, though those things happen too. Most likely you would simply be old, worn out, finished. Because for almost all of human history, making it to 30 was an accomplishment. Making it to 40 was something close to remarkable. And anyone who reached 60 was, in the eyes of everyone around them, ancient, borderline mythical, a living relic. The number that gets thrown around constantly in this conversation is life expectancy at birth of around 30 years for most of human prehistory. And that number is technically true. It is also, in a very important way, deeply misleading. Because the real story of why ancient humans died young is not a story about everyone keeling over, at 30 like clockwork. It's a story about babies. An enormous, staggering number of babies who never made it past their first few years of life, dragging the average down so far that it obscures almost everything interesting about how long people actually lived once they survived childhood. So let's actually unpack what that average number is hiding, why it hides it, and what the real story of aging and dying in the ancient world looked like. Because it is far stranger, far more brutal in some ways, and far more hopeful in others than the simple number suggests. Let's start with the statistic everyone gets wrong. When demographers and anthropologists talk about a life expectancy of 30 years in prehistoric populations, they are talking about life expectancy at birth, which is a mathematical average across an entire population, including every single infant who died in there. First days, weeks, or months of life. And in ancient populations, that number of infant deaths was catastrophically high. Estimates from skeletal analysis and comparative studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that somewhere between a quarter and half of all children born did not survive to see their 5th birthday. Some estimates for particularly harsh environments or difficult periods push that number even higher. Disease, malnutrition, exposure, accidents, complications during birth itself, all of it converged on the most fragile members of the population with devastating consistency. Now here's the part that the simple statistic completely fails to communicate. If you take a population where half the children die before age 5, and then average their age at death, 0, with the age at death of every adult who survives into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and occasionally beyond, you get a mathematical average somewhere around 30. But that average describes almost no actual person in the population. It is not the typical lifespan of a typical individual. It is a statistical artifact created by averaging two completely different populations, infants who died almost immediately, and adults who lived considerably longer, into one misleading number. This is sometimes called the high infant mortality paradox, and once you understand it, the entire framing of ancient human life expectancy changes. The question isn't really why did ancient humans die young? The better question is why did so many ancient infants die so early? And what happened to the people who actually made it past that brutal early filter? Let's talk about that filter first, because understanding why infant and child mortality was so catastrophically high tells you an enormous amount about the conditions of ancient life. Childbirth itself was extraordinarily dangerous for both mother and child. Without modern obstetric care, without antibiotics, without any understanding of germ theory, complications that are now considered routine and manageable could easily prove fatal. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, infection following birth, all of these killed both mothers and infants at rates that are almost unimaginable by modern standards. Estimates suggest maternal mortality rates in pre-modern societies could run anywhere from 1% to 2% per birth, and when you consider that women in these societies frequently gave birth 5, 6, 7, or more times across their reproductive years, the cumulative risk over a lifetime was substantial. For infants who survived birth itself, the dangers were just beginning. The first year of life was a gauntlet of threats that modern parents in developed nations almost never have to seriously consider. Respiratory infections, diarrheal disease from contaminated water and food, which remains one of the leading causes of child death in parts of the world even today where clean water and sanitation are not guaranteed. Malnutrition, particularly during periods of seasonal food scarcity or environmental stress. Parasitic infections that could compound the effects of malnutrition by robbing the body of nutrients it was barely getting in the first place. And there was essentially no medical intervention available for any of it. No antibiotics for the bacterial infections that could turn a minor wound or a simple fever into a death sentence within days. No oral rehydration therapy for the dehydration caused by severe diarrhea, something that today costs almost nothing to treat and saves millions of lives annually, but that simply did not exist as a concept for the vast majority of human history. No vaccines for. Diseases that would later become largely preventable. A child who survived measles, smallpox, dysentery, or any number of infectious diseases that modern medicine now either prevents entirely or treats easily, did so essentially through luck and the strength of their own immune system, with whatever supportive care their family and community could provide. Many simply did not have. The biological luck required. Breastfeeding itself, paradoxically, while generally protective, created its own risks during the weaning process. As infants transitioned from breast milk to solid foods, often prepared with water that carried dangerous pathogens, mortality risk frequently spiked. This weaning period, occurring roughly between 1 and 3 years of age in many traditional societies, represented one of the most dangerous windows in a child's early life, a period during which the protective antibodies provided by breast milk were diminishing, while exposure to contaminated food and water was increasing. So when you add all of this together, hazardous childbirth, infectious disease with no available treatment, malnutrition, dangerous weaning periods, you start to understand why somewhere between 1/4 and half of all children born into ancient populations never made it to their 5th birthday. It wasn't one single catastrophic threat. It was an accumulated gauntlet of threats, any one of which could prove fatal, compounding across the most vulnerable years of human development. Now here's where the story shifts, because once a child survived that brutal early gauntlet, something remarkable happens to the data. Their subsequent life expectancy looks considerably better than the misleading average of 30 years would suggest. Anthropological and demographic research on hunter-gatherer populations, both historical skeletal evidence and studies of contemporary or recently contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, has consistently found that individuals who survived to adulthood, often defined as reaching age 15, had a meaningfully good chance of living into their 60s, 70s, or occasionally beyond. Research conducted by anthropologists, including Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan, examining mortality data across multiple hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist populations, found that once individuals survived childhood, modal adult lifespan, meaning the most common age at death for adults, clustered somewhere in the 60s to 70s range. This is a genuinely important finding because it directly contradicts the popular assumption that ancient humans were simply biologically incapable of living past their 30s or 40s. The biology of human aging has not changed dramatically across the relatively short span of time we're discussing here, evolutionarily speaking. The human body, once it survives early childhood and develops a functioning immune system, has always had the underlying biological capacity to age into what we would now consider old age. The limiting factor was never primarily intrinsic biological deterioration happening unusually fast. It was external risk, things killing people before that natural aging process could fully play out. Think about what this actually means for a moment. If you had managed to survive infancy, survive childhood disease, survive adolescence without dying from infection or injury, and survive the dangers of childbirth if you were a woman, your odds of reaching what we would now call genuine old age, 60, 70, even occasionally 80, were considerably better than the popular imagination typically allows for. The grandparents existed. The elders existed. Societies had old people, sometimes quite a lot of them relative to the surviving adult population, and these older individuals played critical roles in the functioning of their communities. This brings us to something genuinely important and frequently overlooked, which is the grandmother hypothesis, one of the more compelling theories in evolutionary anthropology for why humans specifically evolved such an unusually long post-reproductive lifespan compared to most other mammals. Most mammals, including our closest primate relatives, experience a relatively short window of life after their reproductive capacity ends. Human females, by stark contrast, typically experience menopause sometime in their 40s or 50s, yet frequently live decades beyond that point, assuming they survive the earlier gauntlet of risks we've already discussed. This is evolutionarily unusual. From a pure reproductive fitness standpoint, why would natural selection favor individuals living for decades after they can no longer reproduce themselves? The grandmother hypothesis, developed and refined by researchers, including anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, proposes an elegant answer. Older post-reproductive women, grandmothers, provided enormous fitness benefits to their extended family, not by having more children themselves, but by helping ensure the survival of their grandchildren and freeing up their own adult daughters to have more children sooner and more successfully. Grandmothers in hunter-gatherer societies have been observed and documented contributing substantially to food provisioning, particularly for weaned children who could not yet effectively forage or process difficult-to-extract foods themselves. They provided childcare, freeing mothers to forage, hunt, or otherwise contribute economically to the group. They passed down accumulated knowledge about edible plants, dangerous animals, medicinal remedies, social relationships, and survival techniques refined across an entire lifetime of experience in a world with no written records where the only repository of crucial survival information was living human memory. This created a feedback loop with genuine evolutionary consequences. Women who carried genetic factors associated with longer post-reproductive lifespan helped their daughters and grandchildren survive and thrive more successfully, which meant those genetic factors got passed down more successfully across generations. Over evolutionary time, this contributed to selection pressure favoring extended post-reproductive female lifespan, a pattern that is genuinely unusual among mammals and appears to be a distinctively human adaptation, closely tied to our species' unusual reliance on extended childhood, complex accumulated knowledge, and intensive cooperative caregiving. In other words, the existence of long-lived grandmothers wasn't an accident or a side effect of human longevity. It may have been one of the actual evolutionary drivers of human longevity in the first place. The elderly weren't simply tolerated burdens in ancient societies. In many contexts, they were absolutely critical infrastructure, walking repositories of survival knowledge and direct contributors to the survival of younger generations. Now let's talk about what actually killed adults once they made it past the dangerous early years, because the causes of adult death in ancient populations were considerably different from what kills people in developed nations today, and understanding that difference tells you something important about how human mortality patterns have shifted across history. Infectious disease remained an enormous threat throughout adult life, not just childhood. Without antibiotics, even minor injuries carried serious risk. A cut that became infected, an abscessed tooth, a broken bone that punctured skin, any of these could lead to systemic infection and death in a world without effective antimicrobial treatment. Tuberculosis, a disease that has been found in skeletal remains dating back tens of thousands of years, killed adults across virtually every period of human history before modern medicine, often after a prolonged, debilitating illness. Violence was also a significant cause of death in many ancient contexts, though the degree varied considerably depending on the specific society, time period, and environmental pressures involved. Skeletal evidence from various archaeological sites shows trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, sometimes at rates that would be considered extraordinarily high by modern standards. Researchers studying conflict in prehistoric and early historic populations have found evidence suggesting that violent death rates in some contexts, particularly during periods of resource scarcity or territorial competition, could be substantially elevated compared to modern violent death rates in most developed nations. Accidents and environmental hazards killed people at rates that modern populations, protected by safety regulations, emergency medical services, and infrastructure designed to minimize risk, rarely have to contend with. Falls, animal attacks, drowning, exposure to extreme weather without adequate shelter or clothing, all of these represented real and constant threats throughout adult life in ancient societies. And then there was simply the accumulated wear of physical labor. Ancient human life, across virtually every subsistence strategy from hunting and gathering to early agriculture, involved an enormous amount of sustained physical exertion. Skeletal evidence from numerous archaeological populations shows significant signs of joint degeneration, stress fractures, and other markers of repetitive physical strain, particularly in populations that transitioned into early agricultural lifestyles, which in many cases actually appear to have been harder on the human body than the hunting and gathering lifestyles that preceded them. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings in the archaeological record. The transition to agriculture, often framed in popular imagination as an unambiguous step forward in human progress, frequently correlates in the skeletal record with declining height, increased evidence of nutritional deficiency, and increased markers of physical stress compared to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded agricultural societies in the same regions. Agriculture allowed for larger populations and different forms of social organization, but it did not necessarily make individual human bodies healthier or longer lived. In many documented cases, the opposite appears to have been true, at least during the difficult transitional periods. Let's also talk about something that gets less attention in this conversation but matters enormously, which is the role of social support and community structure in determining who actually survived into old age. Humans are an extraordinarily social species, and in ancient contexts, survival into advanced age was rarely simply a matter of individual biological luck. It was deeply dependent on social context. Individuals embedded in supportive family and community networks, with access to shared food resources, protection, caregiving during illness or injury, had dramatically better odds of surviving the various threats we've discussed than isolated individuals would have. Archaeological and anthropological evidence has documented numerous cases of individuals with significant injuries or disabilities, healed fractures that would have left someone unable to fully provide for themselves, evidence of conditions that would have required ongoing care, surviving for extended periods after their injury or affliction. This tells us something important. These individuals did not survive through individual physical resilience alone. They survived because their community supported them, provided food, protection, and care, even when they could not fully reciprocate that support themselves, at least not immediately. This pattern of mutual care and support extending to the sick, the injured, and the elderly appears across numerous ancient societies and represents one of the genuinely distinctive features of human social organization. We are, and apparently have long been, a species willing to invest substantial resources into caring for vulnerable members of our community, not purely out of immediate reciprocal benefit, but as a more generalized expression of social bonds and collective survival strategy. So where does this leave us in terms of actually understanding why? Ancient humans died young, or perhaps more accurately, in understanding why that framing is somewhat misleading. The honest answer is layered. Ancient infant and child mortality was genuinely catastrophic by modern standards, driven by dangerous childbirth, infectious disease, malnutrition, and the complete absence of modern medical intervention. This high rate of early death dramatically dragged down population-wide life expectancy averages, creating the famous and frequently misunderstood statistic of life expectancy around 30 years. But for those who survived that brutal early filter, adult life expectancy was considerably better than popular imagination often suggests. People regularly lived into their 60s and 70s. Grandparents existed, played critical roles in their communities, and may have actually been a key evolutionary driver of human longevity itself through the mechanisms described by the grandmother hypothesis. The biological capacity for genuine old age has been present in humans for an extremely long time. What changed across history wasn't primarily our biological aging process. It was the external risk environment, the threats capable of killing us before that aging process could fully unfold. This distinction matters because it fundamentally changes how we should think about progress in human history. The dramatic increase in average life expectancy across the past 2 centuries, particularly accelerating with the development of modern medicine, sanitation, vaccination, and obstetric care, was not primarily a story of humans somehow becoming biologically capable of living longer than they previously could. It was overwhelmingly a story of dramatically reducing childhood and infant mortality, and to a lesser but still significant extent, reducing adult mortality from infectious disease, violence, and accidents. We did not fundamentally rewrite human biological aging in the past 200 years. We simply got dramatically better at preventing the deaths that used to cut life short before that biological aging process could naturally play out across the decades it has likely always been capable of spanning. The elderly woman in her 70s surrounded by great-grandchildren existed in ancient societies too. She was simply rarer, not because her body was fundamentally different from yours, but because so many people around her, and so many people around every elder throughout most of human history, never survived long enough to become elderly themselves. That reframing changes something important about how we should think about our ancestors.